management, and we phrased it around three quick key questions. The first was community or private enterprise, and the final one was what happens in terms of longer term control. So how do we build capacity in the community to actually allow them to take ownership of the rear carriage properly. So wattle management. Extent. There was a consensus, I'd say, particularly from the communities, that we should get rid of not all of the wattle, so retain some for community use. I think that was agreed across all the groups. And somebody mentioned a really interesting thing about the woodlots we observed at Vignani, and somebody mentioned there's another one as well at a different location. So if we did go for a kind of approach where we got rid of all of the wattle, could we substitute the use of wood using the existing woodlot? And there's various issues, I think, around why people can't currently get access to that, or why they feel they can't. And somebody mentioned the fact that there's actually a claim at the moment, because it's a government resource, to let the community get access to that. Okay, so in terms of the how, there was a wide range of opinions on how it should be used, how it should be removed. Some people said it should be, in fact, nobody said it should all be government-based in terms of payment for ecosystem services through Working for Water. Somebody suggested it should be a mixture of the current NGO approach with the government as a backup in case there's kind of a gap in funding to be able to clear. Other people said, why don't we try private ventures, employ them to remove, and there was a greater focus in one of the groups on the community themselves being able to take ownership of the clearance. There was a recognition of some trade-offs there, carbon versus water, but also an interesting point that was raised about why don't we change the focus of the current approach from just thinking about clearing certain areas of wattle to kind of conceptualize it in terms of the ecosystem benefits or ecosystem services it provides. So rather than just think about areas, you can think about how much water, additional water, do you want to get from it. Okay, so that was removal. So wattle use. So there was a consensus across all the groups that wattle is of benefit to the communities. So we've gone through many of these things before, but things like timber, water, payment of local people through job creation. An interesting one was mulching on crops I hadn't come across before, but people use it apparently as a mulch on home gardens, shade for livestock, medicinal purposes. But people basically came to the opinion that to improve or add value to this, there needs to be a two-pronged approach. You could create markets within communities, maybe timber, charcoal, but also link with external businesses as well, to explore kind of external links to sale of products. And also further explanation, somebody mentioned on the use of wattle as a livestock feed. So we've got a little experiment we're going to try and do with that. So I think people are unsure at the moment about the best mixes to use with that, or how much damage it's likely to do to animals. We know that goats use it preferentially over cattle, but cattle will eat it. So what research needs to be done to try and explore that? And the final one, which really kind of polarized opinion, was control of regrowth. So this went from, it all needs to be the community which takes control of this, to actually, we should continue with the other mechanism, which is we should be paid for the follow-up stuff as well. So there's a kind of range of opinion on that. But one point that was raised was, why don't we try and build on the grazing agreements, because there's been experimental work that's been done there to try and use the animals to control the regrowth. And I think, have I missed anything? Anyone else contributed? And I've missed them? No?
It's very good.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you. Great. Here, there's some space in the shade here. You can come here. Yes. Shade. You can bring your chair also here on the veranda. Not too far away.
Anyone want to be aboard? Maybe we should send it there. Give it to Dean, he's a nice tall board.
Oh, okay.
Mulvaney, Welcome to the A team. So I'm sure most of you actually can't see the questions because that's sorry. But our focus was on how to enhance the capacity for local natural resource management. Not focusing specifically on wattle or policy, but how do local people manage natural resources better. And we had 3 quite challenging questions, and we landed up going backwards and forwards quite a lot. There's lots of messy notes over there. So I've tried to copy James and make nice neat notes. But the questions essentially are, how can communities be better enabled to tackle natural resource management at landscape scale, so not just in your back garden, the thing that James referred to of almost retreating from the commons into your personal space. How does it happen in commonage? Secondly, how can cooperative management across communities be agreed? And we were a little bit confused, is it within communities or between with other communities? So we looked at both. And thirdly, where is the interface with government and associated policy? Is it actually happening? And Mesibi made a really interesting comment. She says, I don't remember ever being consulted about water and environmental policies, which is frightening. And it's the Contra Lesser traditional courts bill has been well consulted, and I think it's because it's been driven by Contra Lesser through traditional leadership. But a lot of the other policies that affect natural resource management they just come down, they don't go up. So that was a big thing that we felt. I've kind of consolidated these into 3 with about 57 over there, so I hope I haven't missed any. And please guys, remind me if I have. 3 major things. We need two-way awareness. It's not about Nokazola going to the community saying, you guys have to manage your cattle like this. It's about traditional ecological knowledge. It's a new phrase, a new acronym I learned at this workshop, so thanks for that. Understanding how do people use stuff, how do people govern stuff, what bylaws are in place. Social mobilization, that people have constitutional and traditional rights to voices, to resources, to have their say. The value of ecosystem goods and services, what are they actually worth? There was a nice comment about that they shouldn't just be by the way, they're actually the foundation of everything that we do. What is the value of water downstream? What is the value of soil? Why is it so important for carbon? Thinking in the global context. Tony made us think about global yesterday with the red meat price. And we need to be thinking of those ecosystem goods and services are not just here in Matat. They actually affect a much wider regional scale. Learning exchanges, everybody felt they were useful, whether they are between a cynical and a believer group of farmers, where they actually share with each other instead of NGOs or extension workers coming and saying, you guys must do it like this. It's much more effective for people to see it being done. People coming to auctions at Mafube and Zongwana have really learned a lot without a word being said, just by observing. And then the awareness, obviously there's technical shared awareness. It's not just gathering awareness from communities, it's about sharing what are better options and better ways and values of EGS. Secondly, we thought a way to enable people is to build on, Chris says, never squander a good crisis. Climate change is a crisis. And what do we do about it? People are experiencing late rain, late frost. We've lost all our fruit, a lot of our fruit this season. We don't get rain. We get crazy weather patterns. Suddenly there's lots of rain and everything washes away. How do we build on these risks, these threats that everybody is experiencing, and bring in smarter options for ecosystem-based adaptation? Actually, what we are doing is making the landscape more resilient, which means that people who are living and dependent on the land can be more resilient. How do we link household food security, so the retreat back into my land, with commonage through compliance with conservation agreements? We had a nice chat about that. So if we've all got cattle and sheep and we've agreed to keep them out of a certain resting area, and Kedibodi's really naughty and she lets all her sheep in, what do we do about it? How do we withdraw her rights to the commonage or her rights to access? Maybe we don't help her with the household smart EVA technology, or she pays a higher commission at the auctions. So there are lots of ways to link incentives, where's Toysey? He was very strong about bringing in the stick and not just the carrot. The carrot is always nicer, but the stick is sometimes necessary, the punishment and the regulations. Restoring good governance. The reason this is at the bottom is I should have started at the bottom and built up. This was foundational. It came out strongly in all of the groups. Is the landscape has not eroded by itself. It's because the governance has slowly disappeared. And sometimes not so slowly. A lot of people said, since 1994 when democracy came in, things have broken down. And it's a really interesting statement because it seems to have eroded traditional authority. So we put rebuild traditional authority in the proper sense of the word. Not just the authorities, but the authority of the traditional authorities. And that is happening through some quite nicely consulted acts and processes and policies that Controlesa has been driving. We need a better cooperative governance link between, for example, action-led LED programs in municipalities. They are often little standalone, drop in the bucket and they leave. You know, there'll be 200,000 rand spent on a soil conservation project and it just makes absolutely no sense. Build a few gabions and leave. Nobody's consulted, it doesn't benefit anybody, maybe a couple of people made some money being employed. So we really need to link local government planning and SPLUMA, the land use, that crazy act that came in a couple of years ago, which we felt doesn't include traditional authorities enough. The two need to be enmeshed. You cannot have two parallel planning policies. Tony brought up the Umaganda process, and I think they have similar things in Uganda. So that's in Rwanda, and Tony, maybe you can give us a 30-second synopsis.
They have a process where once a month, you have a volunteer day to clean up your local environment, not your home, but your local environment outside of your house. And everybody is expected to be involved, and that's in the whole of the country. I mean, you could start it at a local level, but it's a voluntary community fixing process that basically gets people working without being paid for it.
And Lenswe was giving a few examples of how things used to happen back in the day under Chief Moshesh, where if there was alien plant pulling to be done, everybody was there doing it, or lands to be plowed, everybody was there doing it. It works very well in Uganda, I believe, as well, with alien plant clearing. People are given an area of the river, and that's your responsibility, and if you don't do it, oh my goodness, are you a bad neighbor? You are very frowned upon. So there's a lot of community work opportunities here, again, which need to be led by traditional authorities and maybe policy that comes from the ground up. So I hope that this kind of captures everything that we spoke about there. There were some really amazing comments, one of them being that the conservation agreements, we tend to sign them with what we call grazing associations. And it's actually not the right name. It's way more than grazing. There should be commonage associations or rangeland committees, or we need something that reflects the variety of resources that people get out of their commonage and their rangelands. It's water, thatch grass, medicinal plants, the works, clay, etc. Anybody want to add anything? I'm sure I've forgotten crucial stuff.
Rangeland partitioning. There was some, not everyone knew what was meant by that, but it was, in a nutshell, the efficient or better use of natural resources by defining certain areas to do different things. So whether it's resting cattle or cultivating something. So the first question was partitioning for what use? So we defined here a whole lot of different uses. The first one was a rested area in the grazing land, and then there was cultivated lands. I'm going to skip over one or two. There was also protected areas like wetlands, springs, forests. And then there was that idea of agroforestry as part of clearing alien land. So on some piece of paper we had a picture. So what is meant by that is that in a very alien invaded land you have big trees and little trees, and you don't get much light coming in, and you have nothing growing underneath, and it's just really of use for maybe cattle for shade, and there were other uses mentioned. But if the question is, instead of clearing this area completely where you end up with nothing and potential erosion, the agroforestry idea is where you thin some of these trees. You end up with just some bigger trees. Light comes in, you can get some grass growing, animals can go in there. So I thought it's worthwhile explaining that. Okay, so that's the agroforestry, and I'm not going to go into all of the others because I think it's quite well understood. All right, so then we asked, then we asked how should we do these things. Okay, so the rested areas, there was quite a lot of debate. It's okay. There was quite a lot of debate. Do we need fences, or do we need herders, or do we need both? That wasn't resolved, but basically we need to define that area. And then also fire management in these areas is important because you'll have high standing biomass. So fire breaks or a fire plan. And then the cultivated areas, how do we do this? Cultivated area for fodder production, where we're looking at high value crops. So this would be a big effort. You would need to decide on which lands to use, preferably old lands or lands that are already degraded, not your pristine lands. You would need to plant high value fodder. You would need water, you would need infrastructure, you'd need fertilizer, and you'd need training. You'd have to decide what sort of agriculture you're doing. Is it going to be no-till? Is it going to be conservation agriculture? Okay, I'm going to skip to this is the agroforestry. How do we do the agroforestry? We weren't sure, so we said we don't know how much to thin. We don't know how much we need to thin to let light in and for all of this to work, so that Working for Water can actually go out and do it. So we need to do some research on thinning. We have some information, but we would need to do that. Then our last question was, we're going to partition, and now we sort of know how to do it. Who is going to manage it and how? So with the grazing lands, it was clearly it has to be co-created with the community involved, but the leadership would be the traditional leaders and or ward councillors. It would depend on the communal area, which one is more prevalent, and then work with rangers or herders to have rules about where these places are, and bylaws, and that this should be built and is being built into conservation agreements. And the idea is that there should be buying into this. Otherwise, it's just a line on a map, and then it's not adhered to. There's some issues here around neighbors and what's happening there. So the larger area, the conservation agreements that are potentially involve many communities, so that you have a continuous strip of land would be ideal. Okay, then cultivated lands, how do we do this? We said that training and all the infrastructure and seed and that it would be required. It would be a big effort. We could make use of existing programs in government programs in agriculture, but we know that these are not have sometimes failed because there's maybe staff given but not knowledge. So it would be, we would have to look at how to do that. And I'm going to go to the agroforestry. Again, we said, I think it was similar to your discussion, James, who's going to do this clearing or thinning. It's got to be, obviously working for water would be the ideal implementing agent, but you could have volunteer action in the communities, and the Department of Agriculture would have to be involved. It would be a serious change in the way things are, the way things are done now. Yeah, okay, so there were other partitions of the land, but I think that's all the time we've got. Any questions?
Thumbs up for agroforestry in Littleton.
Yeah,
I think it's got nice nitrogen fixed.
And also I think the really interesting that concept of extending the agreements from a community to multiple communities across the landscape and the way to try and achieve that.
very ambitious, but
Yeah.
really that's
I
way
think that's
to go
the nub of it, really.
to
Yeah.
take catchment, get things going, get things actually working.
Particularly where communities have said we share with X, Y, and Z already. That might be the way to. Yeah.
Is this something you could follow up tomorrow also?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, then I think that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you.